The Uses of Enchantment, the Meaning and Importance of Fairy Tales by Bruno Bettelheim. From Part 2, In Fairyland. Hansel and Gretel. Hansel and Gretel begins realistically. The parents are poor and they worry about how they will be able to take care of their children. Together at night, they discuss their predicament and how they can deal with it. Even taken on this surface level, the folk fairy tale conveys an important, although unpleasant, truth. Poverty and deprivation do not improve man's character, but rather make him more selfish, less sensitive to the sufferings of others, and thus prone to embark on evil deeds. The fairy tale expresses in words and actions the things which go on in children's minds. In terms of the child's dominant anxiety, Hansel and Gretel believe that their parents are talking about a plot to desert them. A small child awakening hungry in the darkness of the night feels threatened by complete rejection and desertion, which he experiences in the form of fear of starvation. By projecting their inner anxiety onto those they fear might cut them off, Hansel and Gretel are convinced that their parents plan to starve them to death. In line with the child's anxious fantasies, the story tells that until then, the parents had been unable to feed their children, but had now fallen upon lean times. The mother represents the source of all food to the children, so it is she who now is experienced as abandoning them as if in a wilderness. It is the child's anxiety and deep disappointment when mother is no longer willing to meet all his oral demands which leads him to believe that suddenly mother has become unloving, selfish, rejecting. Since the children know they need their parents desperately, they attempt to return home after being deserted. In fact, Hansel succeeds in finding their way back from the forest the first time they are abandoned. Before a child has the courage to embark on the voyage of finding himself, of becoming an independent person through meeting the world, he can develop initiative only in trying to return to passivity to secure for himself eternally dependent gratification. Hansel and Gretel tells that this will not work in the long run. The children's successful return home does not solve anything. Their effort to continue life as before, as if nothing had happened, is to no avail. The frustrations continue, and the mother becomes more shrewd in her plans for getting rid of the children. By implication, the story tells about the debilitating consequences of trying to deal with life's problems by means of regression and denial, which reduce one's ability to solve problems. The first time in the forest, Hansel used his intelligence appropriately by putting down white pebbles to mark the path home. The second time, he did not use his intelligence as well. He, who lived close to a big forest, should have known that birds would eat the breadcrumbs. Hansel might have instead have studied landmarks on the way in to find his way back out. But having engaged in denial and regression, the return home, Hansel has lost much of his initiative and ability to think clearly. Starvation anxiety has driven him back, so now he can think only of food as offering a solution to the problem of finding his way out of a serious predicament. Bread stands here for food in general, man's lifeline, an image which Hansel takes literally out of his anxiety. This shows the limiting effects of fixations to primitive levels of development engaged in out of fear. The story of Hansel and Gretel gives body to the anxieties and learning tasks of the young child who must overcome and sublimate his primitive, incorporative, and hence destructive desires. The child must learn that if he does not free himself of these, his parents or society will force him to do so against his will, as earlier his mother had stopped nursing the child when she felt the time had come to do so. This tale gives symbolic expression to these inner experiences directly linked to the mother. Therefore, the father remains a shadowy and ineffectual figure throughout the story, as he appears to the child during his early life when mother is all-important in both her benign and her threatening aspects. Frustrated in their ability to find a solution to their problem in reality because reliance on food for safety, breadcrumbs to mark the path, fails them, Hansel and Gretel now give full rein to their oral regression. The gingerbread house represents an existence based on the most primitive satisfactions. Carried away by their uncontrolled craving, the children think nothing of destroying what should give shelter and safety, even though the birds, having eaten the crumbs, should have warned them about eating up things. By devouring the gingerbread house's roof and window, the children show how ready they are to eat somebody out of house and home, a fear which they had projected onto their parents as the reason for their desertion. Despite the warning voice which asks, "Who is nibbling at my little house?" the children lie to themselves and blame it on the wind and go on eating without disturbing themselves. The gingerbread house is an image nobody forgets. How incredibly appealing and tempting a picture this is, and how terrible the risk one runs if one gives in to the temptation. The child recognizes that, like Hansel and Gretel, he would wish to eat up the gingerbread house, no matter what the dangers. The house stands for oral greediness and how attractive it is to give into it. The fairy tale is the primer from which the child learns to read his mind in the language of images, the only language which permits understanding before intellectual maturity has been achieved. The child needs to be exposed to this language and must learn to be responsive to it if he is to become master of his soul. The preconscious content of fairy tale images is much richer than even the following simple illustrations convey. For example, in dreams as well as in fantasies and child's imagination, a house as the place in which we dwell can symbolize the body, usually the mother's. A gingerbread house, which one can eat up, is a symbol of the mother who in fact nurses the infant from her body. Thus, the house at which Hansel and Gretel are eating away blissfully and without a care stands in the unconscious for the good mother who offers her body as a source of nourishment. It is the original all-giving mother whom every child hopes to find again later somewhere out in the world when his own mother begins to make demands and to impose restrictions. This is why, carried away by their hopes, Hansel and Gretel do not heed the soft voice that calls out to them, asking what they are up to, a voice that is externalized conscience. Carried away by their greediness and fooled by the pleasures of oral satisfaction, which seem to deny all previous oral anxiety, the children thought they were in heaven. But, as the story tells, such unrestrained giving in to gluttony threatens destruction. Regression to the earliest heavenly state of being, when on the mother's breast one lived symbiotically off her, does away with all individuation and independence. It even endangers one's very existence, as cannibalistic inclinations are given body in the figure of the witch. The witch, who is a personification of the destructive aspects of orality, is as bent on eating up the children as they are on demolishing her gingerbread house. When the children give in to untamed id impulses, as symbolized by their uncontrolled voraciousness, they risk being destroyed. The children eat only the symbolic representation of the mother, the gingerbread house. The witch wants to eat the children themselves. This teaches the hearer a valuable lesson. Dealing in symbols is safe when compared with acting on the real thing. Turning the tables on the witch is justified also on another level. Children who have little experience, are still learning self-control, are not to be measured by the same yardstick as older people, who are supposed to be able to restrain their instinctual desires better. Thus, the punishment of the witch is as justified as the children's rescue. The witch's evil designs finally force the children to recognize the dangers of unrestrained oral greed and dependence. To survive, they must develop initiative and realize that their only recourse lies on the pressures of the id for acting in accordance with the ego. Goal-directed behavior based on intelligent assessment of the situation in which they find themselves must take the place of wish-fulfilling fantasies, the substitution of the bone for the finger, tricking the witch to climb into the oven. Only when the dangers inherent in remaining fixed to primitive orality with its destructive propensities are recognized does the way to a higher stage development open up. Then it turns out that the good, giving mother was hidden deep down in the bad, destructive one because there are treasures to be gained. The children inherit the witch's jewels, which become valuable to them after their return home. That is, after they can again find the good parent. This suggests that as the children transcend their oral anxiety and free themselves of relying on oral satisfaction for security, they can also free themselves of the image of the threatening mother, the witch, and rediscover the good parents whose greater wisdom, the shared jewels, then benefit all. On repeated hearing of Hansel and Gretel, no child remains unaware of the fact that birds eat the breadcrumbs and thus prevent the children from returning home without first meeting their great adventure. It is also a bird which guides Hansel and Gretel to the gingerbread house, and thanks only to another bird do they manage to get back home. This gives the child, who thinks differently about animals than older persons do, pause to think. These birds must have a purpose. Otherwise, they would not first prevent Hansel and Gretel from finding their way back, then take them to the witch, and finally provide passage home. Obviously, since all turns out for the best, the birds must have known that it is preferable for Hansel and Gretel not to find their way directly back home out of the forest, but rather to risk facing the dangers of the world. In consequence of their threatening encounter with the witch, not only the children, but also their parents live much more happily ever afterward. The different birds offer a clue to the path the children must follow to gain the reward. After they have become familiar with Hansel and Gretel, most children comprehend, at least unconsciously, that what happens in the parental home and at the witch's house are but separate aspects of what in reality is one total experience. Initially, the witch is a perfectly gratifying mother figure, as we are told how she took them both by the hand and led them into her little house. Then good food was set before them, milk and pancakes with sugar, apples and nuts. Afterwards, 2 pretty little beds were covered with clean white linen, and Hansel and Gretel lay down in them and thought they were in heaven. Only on the following morning comes a rude awakening from such dreams of infantile bliss. The old woman had only pretended to be so kind. She was in reality a wicked witch. This is how the child feels when devastated by the ambivalent feelings, frustrations, and anxieties of the Oedipal stage of development, as well as his previous disappointment and rage at the failures on his mother's part to gratify his needs and desires as fully as he expected. Severely upset that mother no longer serves him unquestioningly, but makes demands on him and devotes herself ever more to her own interests, something which the child had not permitted to come to his awareness before, he imagines that mother, as she nursed him and created a world of oral bliss, did so only to fool him, like the witch of the story. Thus, the parental home, hard by a great forest, and the fateful house in the depths of the same woods are on an unconscious level, but the 2 aspects of the parental home, the gratifying one and the frustrating one. The child who ponders on his own the details of Hansel and Gretel finds meaning in how it begins. That the parental home is located at the very edge of the forest where everything happens suggests that what is to follow was imminent from the start. This is again the fairy tale's way to express thoughts through impressive images which lead the child to his own imagination to derive deeper understanding. Mentioned before was how the behavior of the birds symbolizes that the entire adventure was arranged for the children's benefit. Since early Christian times, the white dove has symbolized superior benevolent powers. Hansel claims to be looking back at a white dove that is sitting on the roof of the parental home, wanting to say goodbye to him. It is a snow-white bird singing delightfully, which leads the children to the gingerbread house and then settles on its roof, suggesting that this is the right place for them to arrive at. Another white bird is needed to guide the children back to safety. Their way home is blocked by a big water, which they can cross only with the help of a white duck. The children do not encounter any expanse of water on their way in. Having to cross one on their return symbolizes a transition and a new beginning on a higher level of existence, as in baptism. up to the time they have to cross this water, the children have never separated. The school-age child should develop consciousness of his personal uniqueness, of his individuality, which means that he can no longer share everything with others, has to live to some degree by himself, and stride out on his own. This is symbolically expressed by the children not being able to remain together and crossing the water. As they arrive there, Hansel sees no way to get across, but Gretel spies a white duck and asks it to help them cross the water. Hansel seats himself on its back and asks his sister to join him. But she knows better. This will not do. They have to cross over separately, and they do. The children's experience at the witch's house has purged them of their oral fixations. After having crossed the water, they arrive at the other shore as more mature children, ready to rely on their own intelligence and initiative to solve life's problems. As dependent children, they had been a burden to their parents. On their return, they have become the family's support, as they bring home the treasures they have gained. These treasures are the children's new won independence in thought and action, a new self-reliance which is the opposite of the passive dependence which characterized them when they were deserted in the woods. It is the females, the stepmother and the witch, who are the inimical forces in this story. Gretel's importance in the children's deliverance reassures the child that a female can be a rescuer as well as a destroyer. Probably even more important is the fact that Hansel saves them once and then later Gretel saves them again, which suggests to children that as they grow up they must come to rely more and more on their age mates for mutual help and understanding. This idea reinforces the story's main thrust, which is a warning against regression and an encouragement of growth towards a higher plane of psychological and intellectual existence. Hansel and Gretel ends with the heroes returning to the home from which they started and now finding happiness there. This is psychologically correct because a young child driven into his adventures by oral and Oedipal problems cannot hope to find happiness outside the home. If all is to go well in his development, he must work these problems out while still dependent on his parents. Only through good relations with his parents can a child successfully mature into adolescence. Having overcome his Oedipal difficulties, mastered his oral anxieties, sublimated those of his cravings which cannot be satisfied realistically, and learned that wishful thinking has to be replaced by intelligent action, the child is ready to live happily again with his parents. This is symbolized by the treasures Hansel and Gretel bring home to share with their father. Rather than expecting everything good to come from their parents, the older child needs to be able to make some contribution to the emotional well-being of himself and his family. As Hansel and Gretel begins matter-of-factly with the worries of a poor woodcutter's family unable to make ends meet, it ends on an equally down-to-earth level. Although the story tells that the children brought home a pile of pearls and precious stones, nothing further suggests that their economic way of life was changed. This emphasizes the symbolic nature of these jewels. The tale concludes, "Then all worries ended, and they lived together in perfect joy." My tale is ended. There runs a mouse, who catches it may make himself a big fur cap out of it. Nothing has changed by the end of Hansel and Gretel, but inner attitudes, or more correctly, all has changed because inner attitudes have changed. No more will children feel pushed out, deserted, and lost in the darkness of the forest, nor will they seek for the miraculous gingerbread house. But neither will they encounter or fear the witch, since they have proved to themselves that through their combined efforts they can outsmart her and be victorious. Industry, making something good even out of unpromising materials, such as by using the fur of a mouse intelligently for making a cap, is the virtue and real achievement of the school-aged child who has fought through and mastered the Oedipal difficulties. Hansel and Gretel is one of the many fairy tales where two siblings cooperate in rescuing each other and succeed because of their combined efforts. These stories direct the child toward transcending his immature dependence on his parents and reaching the next higher stage of development, cherishing also the support of age mates. Cooperating with them in meeting life's tasks will eventually have to replace the child's single-minded reliance on his parents only. The child of school age often cannot yet believe that he will ever be able to meet the world without his parents. That is why he wishes to hold on to them beyond the necessary point. He needs to learn to trust that someday he will master the dangers of the world, even in the exaggerated form in which he fears depict them, and be enriched by it. The child views existential dangers not objectively, but fantastically exaggerated in line with his immature dread. For example, personified as child-devouring witch. Hansel and Gretel encourage the child to explore on his own even the figments of his anxious imagination, because such fairy tales give him confidence that he can master not only the real dangers which his parents told him about, but even those vastly exaggerated ones which he fears exists. A witch as created by the child's anxious fantasies will haunt him, but a witch he can push into her own oven and burn to death is a witch the child can believe himself rid of. As long as children continue to believe in witches, they always have and always will, up to the age when they no longer are compelled to give their formless apprehensions human-like appearance. They need to be told stories in which children, by being ingenious, rid themselves of these persecuting figures of their imagination. By succeeding in doing so, they gain immensely from the experience, as did Hansel and Gretel.